They thought the story ended long ago, that whatever once existed had already faded into dust, buried under new cities, new maps, and new versions of truth. But history has a strange habit. It never disappears completely. It leaves echoes, and sometimes those echoes are louder than the official story itself. Imagine standing in front of a structure so massive that it feels out of place in time, as if it was built for people who saw the world differently, who lived on a different scale. The deeper you look, the more uncomfortable the questions become. Why were these structures designed this way? Why do certain photographs feel wrong, not because they are fake, but because they don't fit what we've been told is normal? The conclusion many arrive at is not that giants must have existed, but that history is far more incomplete than we are willing to admit. Civilizations rise, collapse, and are replaced, and with every replacement comes simplification. Complex stories become easier ones. Details disappear, not always through conspiracy, sometimes through neglect, sometimes through progress itself, but evidence, even when misunderstood, has weight. Old photographs, architectural anomalies, forgotten maps, they all act like fragments of a larger puzzle. And the real ending is not about proving giants existed. It is about realizing how fragile recorded history truly is. The past survives not because it is protected, but because people continue asking questions. And maybe that is the real reason these stories keep returning. Not because they demand belief, but because they awaken curiosity. Because once someone begins to wonder whether something was forgotten, they begin to see the world differently. The silence around lost histories becomes louder than any answer. And in that silence, imagination fills the gaps. The conclusion is simple, yet powerful. The truth about the past is rarely destroyed. It is simply waiting for someone patient enough to look again. There is a moment in every investigation when fascination turns into realization. At first, it feels like entertainment, a mystery to explore late at night. But slowly, patterns begin to emerge. Architectural similarities across continents, construction methods that still puzzle modern engineers, and records that abruptly stop where continuity should exist. The natural conclusion is not that one hidden civilization ruled everything, but that human history has always been more connected and more complex than modern narratives suggest. Entire cultures have vanished before, leaving behind only fragments that later generations misunderstood. When cities are rebuilt and technologies change, meanings are lost. Buildings outlive their creators. Symbols lose their original purpose. And over time, assumptions replace knowledge. This is where the idea of lost giants becomes powerful, not necessarily as literal beings, but as symbols of a forgotten scale of thinking. A time when ambition was larger, when structures were built to last centuries rather than decades. The emotional pull of this story comes from something deeply human, the fear that we may have forgotten something important about ourselves, that progress sometimes moves forward while leaving wisdom behind. And as viewers reach the end of this journey, they realize the mystery is not about size or height. It is about perspective. Every generation believes it understands the past completely, until new discoveries prove otherwise. The real conclusion is that history is not fixed. It evolves with every new question asked, and perhaps the greatest evidence that something once mattered is the fact that people are still searching for it today. By the time the photographs appear, the story changes tone. Images feel different from written accounts because they seem honest. A camera captures a moment without explanation, leaving interpretation to the viewer. And that is exactly why these images continue to spark debate. Some see optical illusions, others see lost evidence. But what truly matters is the emotional reaction they create, the sense that something does not quite align with modern expectations. The conclusion here is not about proving authenticity. It is about understanding why these images continue to hold attention generation after generation. Humans are naturally drawn to unanswered questions. When something challenges what we believe to be normal, it creates tension in the mind, and that tension demands resolution. But sometimes resolution never comes, and that is exactly why the mystery survives. These photographs become more than visual records. They become symbols of uncertainty, reminders that the past was lived by people whose world may have been very different from ours. Over time, explanations emerge. Some logical, some imaginative, perspective distortion, staged photography, cultural exaggeration, all reasonable possibilities. Yet even with explanations available, the fascination remains, because the emotional impact of an image often outweighs the technical explanation behind it. People don't just see what is in the photograph, they feel what it suggests. A sense that something larger existed, whether physically or culturally, a time when ambition and scale felt different. And that emotional response cannot be erased simply by labeling something misunderstood. What truly gives these photographs power is survival. Many documents disappear, many stories fade, but images endure. They resurface decades later, shared, debated, questioned again. Each new generation looks at them through its own lens, shaped by modern beliefs and modern doubts. And in that process, the photographs gain a second life. They stop being evidence of a single moment and become part of an ongoing conversation about how history is remembered. The deeper conclusion is quiet but powerful. Certainty is often an illusion created by incomplete information. The past is rarely as simple as textbooks present it. Details are lost, contexts vanish, and what remains can feel strange when viewed outside its original time. That strangeness invites imagination, and imagination keeps stories alive. Perhaps the real reason these images refuse to disappear is because they remind people that knowledge is never final. Every era believes it has reached understanding, only for future generations to reinterpret the same evidence differently. And that cycle continues endlessly. As this chapter closes, the focus shifts away from proving what the photographs show and toward what they represent. They represent curiosity that refuses to die. They represent the human need to question, to compare, to wonder whether something important slipped through the cracks of recorded history. And maybe that is enough, because not every mystery exists to be solved. Some exist to keep us looking closer, to remind us that the world we inherited was shaped by countless stories we may never fully understand. The images remain, silent and unchanged, while interpretations evolve around them. And in that silence lies their true power. They don't demand belief, they invite reflection. They remind us that history is not only made of facts, but of perception, memory, and the endless human desire to make sense of what came before. There comes a moment in every story where the questions become heavier than the answers, not because the truth is impossible to find, but because time has already changed too much. Civilizations move forward, cities are rebuilt, languages evolve, and slowly the past becomes distant, reshaped by necessity rather than intention. When people talk about erased histories, they often imagine something dramatic, a deliberate removal, a hidden hand rewriting everything. But reality is usually quieter than that. History fades in layers. Records are lost in wars, archives burn, priorities shift, and new generations inherit only fragments of what once existed. The conclusion of this part begins with that realization that forgetting does not always require a conspiracy. Sometimes forgetting is simply the result of time moving faster than memory. And yet, certain things refuse to disappear completely. Massive structures remain standing long after their builders are gone. Architectural choices survive even when their original purpose is no longer understood. Old maps resurface, raising questions about borders and names that no longer exist. These remnants create tension between what is visible and what is explained. People see something enduring, something solid, and instinctively feel that the story behind it must have been larger than the one they were told. That feeling becomes the foundation of the erasure theory, not as a claim of certainty, but as an emotional response to absence. Humans are uncomfortable with gaps in knowledge. When explanations feel incomplete, imagination steps in to fill the silence. And sometimes imagination grows powerful enough to shape belief itself. But the deeper conclusion here is not about proving that something was intentionally hidden. It is about understanding how easily narratives change over time. Every era simplifies the past to make sense of the present. Complex histories are reduced into clean timelines, easier to teach, easier to remember. In that process, nuance disappears. Entire cultures become footnotes. Achievements lose context. And eventually, what remains feels disconnected from the structures and artifacts still visible in the world. This disconnect creates mystery, and mystery creates engagement. People begin asking why buildings seem oversized, why construction methods appear advanced for their time, why certain designs repeat across continents. Whether these questions lead to historical discoveries or simply new interpretations, they serve an important purpose. They keep history alive as a living conversation rather than a closed book. The most powerful realization at the end of this chapter is that the past cannot be fully controlled. Narratives may change, but physical reality endures. Stone, metal, and photographs outlast opinions. They remain long enough for future generations to look again and ask new questions. And perhaps that is why stories of lost worlds continue to resonate. Not because they promise hidden truths, but because they remind us that human knowledge is always incomplete. There is humility in that idea. The understanding that progress does not always mean perfect understanding, and that modern perspectives are only one chapter in a much longer story. As the voice fades, the conclusion settles into something calm and reflective. Maybe nothing was deliberately erased. Maybe history simply moved on. But the traces left behind still matter. They encourage curiosity, skepticism, and imagination, the very qualities that drive discovery forward. And in the end, that may be the most important truth of all. The past survives not through certainty, but through the questions that refuse to disappear. In the end, what stays with people is not a single image or a single theory, but a feeling. The feeling that history is larger than what we can comfortably explain. Every generation looks back at the past believing it understands how the world reached this point. Yet the deeper we look, the more we realize how many pieces are missing. Civilizations rise with confidence, convinced their achievements will last forever, and yet time reshapes everything. Cities change, purposes change, meanings fade, and what once felt ordinary becomes mysterious to those who come later. That is where this story truly finds its conclusion, not in proving whether giants existed, but in recognizing how easily human understanding shifts when context disappears. When people stand before ANSI, NT structures or study old photographs, there is often a quiet moment of disbelief. Not because the evidence demands extraordinary explanations, but because it challenges the assumption that the past was simpler than the present. The idea of a forgotten world speaks to something deeply human, the possibility that knowledge, ambition, or ways of thinking once existed that we no longer fully understand. And that thought lingers because it humbles us. It reminds us that progress is not always a straight line forward. Sometimes things are lost along the way. Sometimes stories become smaller as time moves on, simplified so they fit neatly into textbooks and timelines. But reality has never been neat. Human history is layered, complex, and often incomplete. The fascination with lost giants endures because it represents more than physical size. It represents scale of imagination, the sense that earlier civilizations may have viewed the world differently, built differently, and believed differently. Whether those interpretations are literal or symbolic almost stops mattering. What matters is the emotional response they create, curiosity mixed with wonder. And curiosity is powerful. It keeps stories alive long after facts alone would have been forgotten. As this journey closes, the audience is left not with answers, but with perspective. The realization that history is not something finished and sealed, but something continuously re-examined. Each new generation asks different questions, notices different details, and reaches different conclusions. The past does not change, but our understanding of it does. And that constant reinterpretation is what keeps history alive. The photographs remain, the structures remain, the unanswered questions remain. They stand as reminders that certainty is temporary, while curiosity endures. Perhaps that is why stories like this continue to resonate across cultures and time. They allow people to imagine possibilities beyond the limits of what is already known. And in doing so, they reconnect us with something essential, the desire to explore, to question, and to look beyond the obvious. Because in truth, the greatest mystery is not whether a forgotten civilization once existed. The greatest mystery is how much of our own story is still waiting to be understood. And as long as people continue to look back with wonder instead of certainty, the echoes of forgotten worlds will never truly disappear.